Representative Griffith, you are up first. And just make sure your mic is on, that's all.
All right, there we go. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Let me start, because I am going to mention him later, in just saying that it was my privilege and honor to call Don McEachin a friend. We rarely agreed on policy, but as several have mentioned here today, he was always had a smile. He was a very good lawyer, and I've got a story to go with one of my amendments that involves Don, and as I was contemplating it after learning the news last night, I thought about taking it out, and then I thought, no, it's a good story that talks about his legislative skill. I left it in my comments, but before we started, I wanted to let everybody know that while we didn't agree, he was a good friend.
Thank you.
And we served in the Virginia House before we served in this House together, and so we were longtime colleagues. All right, that said, I don't know what numbers you all have, but the first one I have is my legislative text change, which reinstates the Holman rule. And I have a handout, an article by Mark Strand from the last time the Holman rule came into effect, and I'll give that to our stenographer, and y'all can do with it what you will. But it's an article that talks favorably about the benefits of the Holman rule. It is really not as big a deal as some have made it out to be. I wish I could say, since I revived it some years ago, that it was as big as the Washington Post thought it was in changing the way we do business. But it is one of many steps we can take that empowers individual members in trying to affect spending, and it allows you to retrench spending in an agency, which would include rearranging the deck chairs, so to speak. And you can eliminate a deck chair or two if you wish. The rule, and it's existed for roughly 100 years on and off in Congress. The rule is rarely effective in getting passed on the floor, but in those occasions when it has made a substantial change and exercised the will of the people through the People's House. I think it's a tool that we ought to have as members, and look, all of the amendments that I'm going to propose today are attempts to try to make this place work better and to empower individual members. The Holman rule is just one small part of that. I would like to see a number of these adopted.
Mr. Griffith, can you just recap the Holman rule, please?
Sure. So what the Holman rule does is it goes into Rule 21, and it allows you to cut spending and reorganize an agency inside of an appropriations bill. It has to be a general appropriations bill. It can't be any other bill. That's one of the criteria. You have to, it comes up on the floor and you have to get a majority, which is why it's hard to get any of the amendments passed. In fact, we used it for 2 years previously, and I don't believe, in fact, I know that none of the amendments were successful. I had one of my own, got some interesting information out of it, had a good debate. It allowed the members to figure out what was going on in a particular issue, but nothing actually passed. And that is the history of the Holman rule over its 100 years, is that I would dare say maybe a dozen things have passed during that time period. But it's a safety valve that allows members to say, wait a minute, this agency isn't working right, and we think there's a better way to do it with retrenchment. You can't increase spending, you have to cut spending overall. But you can rearrange things. One that comes to mind, and I'm not planning on putting this in, but just comes to mind, is CDC's never been actually authorized, and while Energy and Commerce probably ought to figure out how to authorize the CDC, if we felt like there needed to be major changes, and even the CDC director says there need to be some changes, and if that needed to be done with a retrenchment, then you could possibly use that as a way to do that, or just to have a good discussion on the floor in a legislative body. So that's what it does. All right. So that pretty much explains the Holman rule. Mr. Chairman, I don't know if you want me to stop and answer questions or go. I could go through the whole package and then open it up for questions.
Why don't you go through the questions, and Mr. Burchett is here too, and you can follow Mr. Griffith, and we could go to questions. What did I say? Okay.
You gave it a fancier.
The French pronunciation.
Yeah. So you want me to stop, answer questions?
Yeah. Why don't you go through your?
Let him go. That's
fine. Why don't you come on up?
Because I got about 7 or 8.
Yeah, we have a little panel. Why don't you keep going? Yeah. Keep going through yours.
Oh, you want me to keep going? Okay.
I'm supposed to be here or not, I don't know.
Yeah, have a seat.
You're here. All right.
All right,
Yeah, good.
the next one that I have is a change in the germaneness rule. That's in Rule 16. This would allow the speaker to have a more strict germaneness rule. So it restates in the germaneness rule, we got the germaneness rule. It then goes in and gives the speaker guidelines on what the speaker is to look at when determining if something is germane. The purpose of that, quite frankly, is to allow the speaker to set new precedent and create a more strict germaneness rule. Over the course of probably 100 years, and I haven't studied it carefully, but it looks like that's about right, we've gotten laxer and laxer, and the precedents have made it so that really our germaneness rule is pretty weak. This says if you're going to bring an amendment in, it's got to be germane to the original purpose of the bill. That's why you look at the title. The guidelines say look at the title, look at the code sections that are affected in the bill, look at the agencies that are affected in the bill. If you go outside of that, and if the original purpose is the doc fix in Medicare, you can deal with the doc fix in Medicare, but you can't come in and suddenly say we're going to take this bill that touches Medicare in one spot and turn it into an overall reform of Medicare. And you also, which we had happen, I know that was a rules issue, but we had it where the doc fix and, y'all might remember this, and the payment in lieu of taxes were added together in a single bill or in a single vote. Clearly not germane, and clearly shows how far afield we've gotten from the idea that and what the people expect us to do. They expect us to vote on one concept, one idea, what the bill did. It doesn't mean you can't have complex bills, but it has to be a part of the original concept and not something that suddenly got added on in committee, in rules, or on the floor. And the speaker would have the ability, and I gave the speaker, and I'll get to that later, I gave the speaker the ability to make that decision solely because I think we need to have a new understanding of germaneness, and an incoming speaker is the best chance to do that. And in order to do that, you have to change the rule just a little bit, so you got a new rule to work with, and you give them a new chance to set new precedent. And that's the purpose of that one. All right, moving on to the next, which I have as number 3. It's titled Bill Limitations. I will tell you it started off as 2 different amendments, and they are clearly severable. They're 2 different concepts, but they line up in the rules at the same spot. So I have in Rule 12, 2A, and then a separate and severable issue 2B. Let me talk about 2A first. 2A is that no bill shall be introduced which contains more than one purpose or question or questions of a bill that violates a single purpose rule. The speaker, on those questions, the speaker also would have the ability to make that decision. Again, we sometimes get far afield. We don't, while we talk about single purpose, and this is stuff the American people want and love. They like the idea of us voting on a single purpose. They like the idea of any amendments coming in being germane to the underlying bill. What this says, it just puts it in the rule. Again, a new speaker, and I would hope that a new speaker would interpret these strictly, because I think it makes our legislative process easier and better when you get to the floor, because you don't have to worry about all kinds of superfluous issues being suddenly raised on the floor with an amendment, which is one of the reasons why we've gone further and further away from open rules. I don't think we've had a true open rule in years, is because we're worried about, somebody putting in, whether it be on the left or on the right, putting in some kind of a crazy amendment. What this would allow us to do, in combination with the germaneness new rule, it would allow a speaker the ability to hone it in, make an announcement to everybody, hey, we're changing the tenor of this, and we're not going to allow those kinds of superfluous amendments to be brought to the floor. The second part, 2B, if I might go forward, is, and this one's a little dicier and not as loved by anybody, but it is a calendar deadline to introduce bills. Now, I put a proposal together because you got to start somewhere. I'm not saying that I've got this down pat. Some of these others I can defend to the death. This one's a little closer, but I do think that we need to figure out a schedule, because what happens is that we have bills that are introduced all the time. That leads to, and all of us have probably done it, I know I have, some issue comes up, it's the cause célèbre of the day, and your constituents want to know what you're going to do about it. Well, I'm putting a bill in today. And we get hundreds of those bills, and most of the time, they don't come to the floor. But what happens is we have legislative staff, we have legislative services, or the people who help draft, the drafting people, they put in overtime to get all of this stuff drafted up and get it introduced. What this says is if you've got an idea and you really like that idea, get it in. Now, I picked June 1st of each year. Get your bills in by June 1st. After that, and I went fairly relaxed on it, after that, in order to put a bill in, you would need consent of the House. You don't have to have unanimous consent. I came out of the Virginia legislature. I was a member of the Virginia House for many years. And in that context, we had to have unanimous consent if you passed the deadline. I'm not asking for unanimous consent, but you've got to come to the floor and say, hey, I got a really good idea. I think it ought to be a bill, and then the House has to vote on it. What that'll do is it better be something you're really passionate about if you're going to come and do a mea culpa in front of the whole House. Now, I will tell you that I put it in as a calendar event. It may actually make more sense, and I'm happy to work with anybody who wants to work on this, to say that you want to do this based on a term, in which case I would propose January 30th of the second year of the term. It would not reduce as much the drive-by legislation or the legislation for cause célèbre of the day, but it would guarantee that in the second year you're dealing with the major issues and you're not dealing with a lot of distractions because everybody's had plenty of time to put their bill in. So those are a couple of the bills. I got more. Hang tight. I have also a change in rule, and it's my numbered 4, Rule 29, and it's a limitation on waiver. Now, this goes hand in hand with germaneness and having the speaker make a decision on that, and with the single-purpose rule. And it says that you shall not waive it without 2/3 vote of the whole House. Now, majoritarian House. House can waive it with 51. They can waive the rule that it has to be 2/3. The point of putting this into the rules is to make it clear that the germaneness rule and the single-purpose rule are special and should not be treated as just some other rule. That it is our intent that you ought to have a supermajority to waive those 2 rules. That you shouldn't just do it willy-nilly because on that particular day you felt like you wanted to get out by 2 o'clock instead of, working on something until 6 o'clock. I know people have a long way to go home, and I understand that. But the American people elected us to get a job done and not waive all the rules that may make things less comfortable, but I think this would help us in running this place more efficiently and more effectively over a long period of time. All of us are sloppy. We don't pay attention to it. We just throw stuff in. Oh, it's close, but we need to pay attention to that. Also going in line with some of these other rules, if you're going to have strict germaneness and you're going to have strict single purpose, which the American people I think want, and you make it clear you don't want it waived, if a speaker is consistently violating that, I think we need to have a vacate the chair motion. Now, I've put some guardrails on it because I think there are legitimate concerns with vacate the chair in the modern era. It worked for over 200 years. It worked very well. Only came up a few times. But today we're living in a world where there's 24-hour news. There's Twitter. I mean, we've all been in meetings where things are said, and before we can get out of the meeting, it's already all over Twitter and starts to get on Facebook and goes other places. A speaker cannot establish their administration and establish that they're doing a good job if there's an everyday motion to vacate the chair. I do think an individual member ought to have that right to bring the motion. It's not exactly, but it's kind of like our version of a no confidence vote. And so what I did was I said that any new speaker gets 7 months to get their administration established. At the end of the 7 months, a vacate the chair motion then becomes in order for any member to make. If a speaker faces a vacate the chair motion and succeeds in surviving the motion, a new motion cannot be made for 60 days. Some might argue for 90. I prefer 60, but you've got to, I think today, to have a true vacate the chair, which restores power to the individual members, you also have to have guardrails on it. Because in the old days, what you did in D.C., probably the public back home didn't know about for at least a week or two and sometimes months. Today, sometimes my constituents know what happened in a different committee before I do. And so that's why I thought that we need to look for some hybrid language that restores to the individual members. Each member should have a right to say, wait a minute, something's not working right here, and have a way to clean up things if necessary. I don't think it's going to be necessary very often. It wasn't for 200 years necessary very often. In fact, one of the times, the Speaker himself called for a vacate the chair motion to prove that he had the support on the floor, and he did. So that's my modified vacate the chair Rule 9. Timing of action reports. This one gets a little complicated. I'll do my best to explain it to you. You may have some questions on it, but this one is kind of interesting. What it just says is if a bill comes out of a committee, the Rules Committee has to send that to the floor within 10 days, or it comes up to the floor, 10 legislative days. It has to come to the floor in order to be acted on. If it comes out of a primary committee, that does two things in my opinion. One, make sure that if we pass a bill out of a committee, it actually gets a vote on the floor before that term of Congress goes poof. That doesn't always happen. A lot of times bills come out and they never get seen again. It also guarantees, I think, that the committee will do better work on the various bills, because we shouldn't be fixing bills on the way to the floor. And that brings up my Don McEachin story. I think it was the bill that dealt with surprise billing. Don raised a point in the committee. He said this doesn't work in Virginia because of the common law and statutory requirements in Virginia on the doctrine of necessities. I looked at it. My only complaint was he found it first. It was brilliant lawyering. He was absolutely right. We got we'll work on that on the way to the floor. I spoke to Don 6-8 months ago. I said, do you know if they ever got it fixed? Because I never got any word back that it had been fixed. He said, I don't know. I probably ought to check into that. The members have no way of knowing. We fix things on the way to the floor, and it's very efficient in the sense of getting things moved, but it's why sometimes you all get bills here in this committee that are not yet ready for prime time. If that bill is not yet ready for prime time, if two members raise an objection based on a good legal, this was not philosophical at all. The bill was a good bill overall. The fixing of this doctrine of necessities issue would have made the bill better. And in fact, in the Virginia legislature, the chair would have looked, because you couldn't send a bill out till it was ready for prime time because it was going to show up on the floor 3 days later, the chair would have said, all right, Don and Morgan, the rest of us don't understand this. Y'all go out and figure out a fix. We'd have gone out in the hallway and come back with a fix in 15 minutes. It will make the committees work to get a bill that is in fact ready for prime time instead of saying, let's push it off to rules and let them fix it on the way to the floor. We should do our job in every committee. We should do good legislation. Don McEachin stood for that. He was a great lawyer. Again, I disagreed with him on a lot of issues. This one had no philosophy to it other than trying to get the law right. And Dr. Burgess mentioned that earlier, that was one of Don's hallmarks. Let's get the law right, even if I don't agree. I feel the same way. This rule would allow you to do that. Now, 10 legislative days enough? Do you need 14? But it shouldn't be unending. Then there comes up the issue where we send bills to multiple committees. So I created a safety valve for that. So if the primary committee reports it out, then once it is out of the primary committee, the remaining committees, and I got to figure out what I picked out here. I think I gave them 7 legislative days. All of the other committees have to make a decision on what they're going to do within 7 legislative days. Now, as committees are wont to do, they may come out with different versions of the bills. The Rules Committee, after hearing from the chairperson of that committee, of each of the committees involved in the various versions, or their designee, can then form the final bill, figure out what the differences are in the bills, and conform them to one bill that then gets sent to the floor. I allow additional time so that rules can work on that and get that done before the bill has to be reported to the floor, but it still has to be reported to the floor. Or, in the alternative, the Rules Committee can say, these things are so different and they're not ready for prime time, they can re-refer it or refer it back to the committees of jurisdiction to straighten it out and explain this doesn't work, or we don't understand what Committee A is trying to do here, Committee B and A get together, y'all figured out, we're sending it back. Have every right to do that. As does the floor in the case if a bill gets to the floor that's not right. We can always send it back to rework it. So that's the purpose of the timing on the timing action on all bills. But that way, if a bill gets out of committee, people know there's going to be action. It's not going to go into some black hole that nobody ever sees again. And oftentimes it's not philosophical. It's that leadership, because they feel like they have to look at everything and time everything, they oftentimes don't have time to get to all of it. And so some good bills get left on the sidelines that the committee has already approved. Now, sometimes the leadership is trying to get a good press conference going and they want to pick a special day. You know, if we got a bill that deals with, you know, people falling in love, then they want to time it for Valentine's Day. Well, this just says, get your bills out. Let's do good legislative work. Let's not worry about the press conference. Press conferences are important. It's a part of our business. But legislating is a more important part of our business. All right, last but not least, I might be the only person in the entire house who loves this one. Proportional seating on committees. It's language that was taken out of the Virginia rules. Virginia adopted this rule in 1998. It is a tough rule. It's a tough love situation. And what it says you got to do is that if the House is divided, because we're a democratic republic, or a republic based on democratic principles, if the House is divided 60-40, the committees ought to be 60-40. If the House is 51-49, committees ought to be 51-49. There's a formula to take care of half people, because you can't obviously have a half a person on a committee. So all of the fractional seats are rounded towards the majority. Whoever has the majority gets that extra seat. It doesn't apply to rules and it doesn't apply to ethics. But you got to have, I think, to get good legislation. Now, you know, people don't like it because you can't get things done. But let me just give you a classic example of why this isn't right. And I'm not trying to pick on either side. It's just the one that I happen to know right now. When we came in 2 years ago, the Democrat majority was 51%, so it was 51-49. But the Energy and Commerce Committee, on which I serve, had a larger majority numerically than for the Democrats than the Democrats had on the floor. Now, I'm not saying Republicans haven't done similar things. I'm not trying to pick on either side. I'm just trying to get a system that works for everybody and does what our founders and what the prior people wanted us to do, which is to respect that we are a republic, but that we're based on democratic principles. What's better than that than saying the committee that's working on legislation and sending it to the floor is divided exactly the way the voters, or as close as you can get it to a whole person, the way the voters intended it to be done when they sent us here. It's hard. But when we started this, and of course it changes as people retire or unfortunately pass away, as we've had mentioned both today of Don McEachin and Jackie Worlorski. Those numbers shift. So you go with the beginning of the term and you figure out those proportions, and unless they shift dramatically, you leave them alone during the term. I would say you leave them alone even if it shifts dramatically, but usually it's not going to be much. We started it at 51-49. The Energy and Commerce Committee was 55-45. It's just not what the people back home expect us to do. If you asked them, what does common sense tell you to do? They would say, if they knew about it, and they don't. I'll borrow my friend here's line. He always says he's the 435th most important man in Congress. Powerful man in Congress. You ought to pay attention. I'm feeling that way on this amendment. I'm the 435th most influential on this issue. Probably not going to happen. But if you ask people back home if they knew about it, and if they said, do you think the committees ought to be divided up the way the voters sent us here, for good, bad, or other, they would say yes. Yes, they would. Independents are also covered, and they get counted in the majority number. If you have independents. I don't think we have any this time, but we will ultimately. I'm sure in the future have a few independents. And so that's taken care of in here as well. That being said, that's a brief summary, as you can probably tell, and I didn't use my notes much because I'm passionate about all of this stuff. I want this place, and it's not exclusive. There are lots of other amendments that you all are going to hear today that I would support. But I think that that Washington doesn't function well. It's not a product of Republicans. It's not a product of Democrats. It is a product of years and years of piling on of precedent and nobody examining things and saying, how can we do it better? These are just a handful of ideas. Like I said, I know a lot of others that are going to be put in today that are good ideas as well. But these are a handful of ideas that I personally feel ought to be given careful examination and adopted. I don't speak for any group on these, although some groups may like parts of it. As I said, I've put stuff in there that irritates everybody in one way or another, but I'm trying to get Congress to operate better, and I hope that this in some small measure has helped. I yield back.
Thank you very much.